The sound of brass echoed through a smoky club on Bourbon Street. A young man stood under the dim light, eyes closed, feeling every note before he ever sang it. His voice carried something raw, part gospel, part pain, part promise. People stopped talking. They could feel it, too. He didn't have the fame of James Brown, but he had the same fire. His name was King Floyd, and for one brief moment, the world moved to his rhythm. Then, almost as quickly as he appeared, the spotlight faded, leaving behind a song that never stopped playing in the hearts of those who listened. What happens to a voice that once made America dance when the music stops? Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before there was fame, before there was a record deal, there was just a boy in Crescent City, Louisiana, King Floyd III. Born on the 13th of February, 1945, he grew up surrounded by the hum of rhythm and blues that drifted through the neighborhoods of New Orleans. The city was alive with sound, trumpets crying from open windows, church choirs echoing on Sunday mornings, and street performers turning every corner into a small stage. Music wasn't something you chose in New Orleans, it chose you. King was raised in nearby Kenner, a quiet community where most folks worked hard and dreamed small. But King dreamed in stereo. He would listen to radio stations broadcasting from Memphis and Chicago, soaking up the deep grooves of Sam Cooke, Ray Charles, and Little Willie John. At night, he'd hum to himself, shaping a voice that carried both the warmth of the South and the ache of ambition. By his early teens, that voice began to earn attention. King and his friends performed on street corners, drawing small crowds who tossed coins into an open guitar case. Every note felt like a promise that something greater was waiting. Then came the night that changed everything, his first paying job at the Show Bar on Bourbon Street in 1961. The club lights flickered red and gold as King stepped onto the stage, introduced by New Orleans legend Mr. Google Eyes. When he sang, the chatter stopped. For the first time, he wasn't just a kid from Kenner, he was an artist. But just as his career began to bloom, life called him elsewhere. The military draft pulled him away from the stage and into uniform. The dream that once seemed within reach was now put on hold. In the quiet moments between duties, he wrote lyrics on scraps of paper, humming melodies under his breath. Even the army couldn't silence the rhythm inside him. When he was discharged in late 1963, King didn't go home, he went to chase possibility. He moved to New York City, where the nights were cold, but the clubs were hot with energy. Harlem was alive with soul, jazz, and ambition. He signed with Shaw Artists, a booking agency that kept him performing across Manhattan. Between shows, he studied the greats Don Covey, J.J. Jackson, and began writing his own songs, determined to carve out a voice that was distinctly his. A year later, the road led him west to Los Angeles. There, fate introduced him to Harold Batiste, another New Orleans musician who had found refuge in California's growing music scene. Batiste saw something pure in King's tone, something that reminded him of the city they both missed. Through Batiste, King met DJ Buddy Kelly, who introduced him to Original Sound Records. In 1965, the label released his debut single, Walking and Thinking. It didn't make the charts, but it gave him something just as valuable, a beginning. By 1967, with Batiste's help, King released his first full album, King Floyd and Man in Love, on Mercury's subsidiary Pulsar. The songs were tender and full of promise, but they failed to find an audience. The dream had hit its first wall. With little money and no direction, he packed his bags and returned home to New Orleans in 1969, taking a steady job at the post office to make ends meet. But every night, after sorting letters and closing the heavy doors of the post office, he would write. Sometimes just a line, sometimes an entire verse. His coworkers knew he was different. He wasn't just mailing people's dreams, he was still chasing his own. That's where destiny found him again. One evening, while talking music with friends, someone mentioned that producer Wardell Quezergay was back in town. Quezergay was already a legend in the local scene, a man known for turning raw talent into gold. King had no idea that meeting him would change his life forever. Before the fame, before the spotlight, there was just a young man in Louisiana with a stubborn dream and a voice too soulful to stay hidden. By the time King Floyd returned to New Orleans, The dream that once burned so bright had dimmed to an ember, but it hadn't gone out. The city had changed since he left, yet its heartbeat was the same. On humid nights, he could still hear horns echoing through the French Quarter, the pulse of the city reminding him who he was. He spent his days delivering mail, and his nights writing songs, scribbling lyrics on the back of envelopes and discarded scraps of paper. His life was divided between the ordinary and the extraordinary, a man in uniform by day, an artist in exile by night. Those songs carried a different kind of soul now. They weren't just about love or rhythm anymore. They were about longing, about waiting for a second chance. It was in one of those restless evenings that he met Wardell Quezergue, the New Orleans producer known as the Creole Beethoven. Quezergue had a gift for hearing potential where others heard nothing. When he listened to King hum a few lines, he stopped and said, "That's not just a song. That's a hit waiting for a reason." Quezergue was working with Malaco Records, a small studio in Jackson, Mississippi, that was quietly shaping a new Southern sound. He invited King to come record a few of his originals. King agreed, taking time off from the post office and packing his notebooks filled with half-finished lyrics. On the 17th of May 1970, they entered Malaco's modest studio. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of warm tape machines. Musicians tuned their instruments while King stood quietly in the corner, flipping through his notes. Among them was a song called "Groove Me." He had written it for a woman who'd walked out of his life before he could give her the lyrics. Now, all that remained was the rhythm. The band began to play, and something clicked. The groove was tight, effortless, a heartbeat wrapped in brass and bass. King stepped up to the mic, closed his eyes, and let everything he'd held inside pour out. They finished the take in one go. When the last note faded, the room fell silent. Quezergue smiled. "That's the one," he said. Still, no one could have guessed what that one would become. The song was released as the B-side to What Our Love Needs, buried beneath the radar. But somewhere in New Orleans, DJ George Van flipped the record over and played "Groove Me" on air. The phone lines lit up. People wanted to know who that voice was. Within weeks, "Groove Me" became a local anthem. Atlantic Records took notice and offered national distribution. Suddenly, King Floyd, the postal worker with a dream, was on the radio across America. He didn't know it yet, but that single take in a smoky Mississippi studio had just changed the course of his life. When "Groove Me" began spinning on radio stations across the South, King Floyd's life shifted almost overnight. The man who had once sorted mail in a quiet New Orleans post office was suddenly being played from car stereos, jukeboxes, and late-night soul programs. It was more than a hit, it was a sound that defined a moment in American rhythm and blues. Atlantic Records quickly acquired national rights to the single, pushing it onto every major station. By Christmas Day 1970, "Groove Me" had reached #1 on the Billboard R&B chart and #6 on the pop chart, earning a gold record. For King, the success felt both surreal and overdue. After years of rejection, sleepless nights, and silent prayers, the world was finally listening. He quit his postal job and joined a national tour, performing in clubs, theaters, and television shows. On stage, he was magnetic, commanding yet unpretentious. He didn't strut like James Brown or shout like Joe Tex. His power came from smooth control, a steady rhythm that made every crowd move in sync. Audiences loved his blend of raw emotion and danceable groove. He wasn't just another singer, he was the soul of the South, wrapped in velvet rhythm. His follow-up single, "Got to Have Your Love," climbed into the R&B top 10 inches early, 1,971. The momentum carried him straight into his self-titled album, King Floyd, released through Atlantic. The record showcased his versatility, funky bass lines, tender vocals, and lyrics that balanced love with loneliness. Critics began calling him the quiet storm before the storm, a nod to how his sound bridged classic Southern soul and the evolving funk era. For a time, it seemed King Floyd had arrived exactly where he was meant to be. He was touring with confidence, performing alongside names he once admired from afar. When he looked out from the stage and saw crowds singing his words back to him, it felt like redemption. Yet even at the height of his success, the cracks were beginning to show. Behind the curtain, creative disagreements started to brew between King and Wardell Quezergue. King wanted to experiment to blend more of the street-level funk he heard in New Orleans clubs, while Wardell believed in maintaining the structured soul sound that had brought them success. Their sessions grew tense. The friendship that had birthed a hit began to fray under the pressure of expectation. In the midst of these tensions, King still tried to push forward. He poured himself into new material, searching for another spark that could match Groove Me. The next album, Think About It, released in 1973, carried that spirit, a confident, reflective body of work, but the public had moved on too quickly. Disco and pop-funk were taking over radio waves, and his southern brand of soul began to feel out of step with the new decade. Still, the music didn't lie. Songs like Woman Don't Go Astray showed his emotional depth, combining grit with grace. The track was later re-released by Atlantic and, almost miraculously, earned a gold certification years after its original debut. But by then, the momentum had cooled. King Floyd's rise was proof that talent alone couldn't hold back time. The industry was shifting, labels were changing hands, and audiences were chasing the next new sound. Yet for those who truly listened, Groove Me was timeless, a record that captured the heartbeat of a generation. He had climbed from street corners to center stage, but as the applause faded, a familiar silence began to creep back in. By the summer of 1971, King Floyd was everywhere. Groove Me had turned him into a household name in soul circles, and his follow-up hits proved it wasn't a fluke. On stage, he carried himself with quiet authority, no flashy costumes, no choreographed spins, just a man, a microphone, and a rhythm that could pull the whole room into its orbit. Audiences across America swayed to his sound. In smoky clubs from Chicago to Atlanta, people shouted his name, clapped in time, and smiled at one another as soon as the first notes of Groove Me hit the air. For a generation still caught between Motown polish and the raw pulse of Southern funk, King Floyd felt like both a bridge between worlds. During his national tour, he played to packed houses. He didn't scream or boast. He grinned and let the groove speak. His voice had the warmth of church and the grit of the streets, the same combination that had made artists like Otis Redding and James Brown legends. But there was something gentler in Floyd, an emotional restraint that made his music feel human, not heroic. The King Floyd album that followed was a statement of identity. Tracks like Got to Have Your Love carried irresistible rhythm, while softer songs revealed a tenderness few male singers dared to show in that era. He was redefining what soul could sound like: intimate, yet danceable, joyful, yet aware of its own fragility. Music critics began to take notice. One writer from Billboard called him a man who grooves with purpose. Radio hosts spoke about him as the next wave of New Orleans sound, a reminder that the city's musical heart was still beating strong long after the first generation of jazz and R&B pioneers. Floyd's success meant freedom, but it also meant pressure. Every show came with expectation. Every new song was weighed against his first hit. He moved between studios and cities, recording sessions that blurred together, trying to capture lightning in a bottle again. Still, for a moment, life seemed golden. He bought his mother a house, surrounded himself with musicians he trusted, and felt the kind of pride only hard-earned success can bring. When he stepped on stage in those years, the applause was deafening, yet his expression remained calm, almost meditative. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was living inside it. But in the music industry, peaks never last long. As the 1970 unfolded, new trends began to stir beneath the surface. The clean, slick sound of disco was creeping into the charts, changing what labels wanted and what radio stations played. For now, though, that noise was distant. King Floyd was still the man of the moment, the quiet soul giant from New Orleans who had written a song that could make even the toughest crowd move. And as the lights glowed and the band played Groove Me one more time, he smiled, unaware that the rhythm that lifted him would soon start to fade. Every success story in music carries a shadow, and for King Floyd, that shadow came quietly. While his songs filled the airwaves, the world around him was changing faster than anyone could keep up. The soulful, brass-heavy grooves that once ruled the radio were giving way to something slicker, shinier disco lights, replacing stage spotlights, strings replacing horns. Inside the studio, tension began to replace harmony. His creative bond with producer Wardell Quezergay, the man who had helped shape Groove Me, started to fray. What had once been built on trust and shared intuition turned into debates about direction. King wanted to explore deeper funk and more freedom in his sound. Wardell wanted structure, discipline, and polish. Their arguments weren't explosive, they were worse. They were quiet, filled with unspoken disappointment. Each session felt heavier, each mix less inspired. For a man like Floyd, who had built his career on emotion, that loss of feeling cut deeper than any bad review could. By 1973, King released Think About It, an album that carried everything he believed in honesty, rhythm, and heart. But the label didn't know how to promote it. Radio had moved on, chasing the new sound of Philadelphia soul and the early pulse of disco. Despite its quality, the album slipped through the cracks. Atlantic Records made one last push, releasing Woman Don't Go Astray, a song recorded years earlier. Miraculously, it caught on and earned a gold certification 3 years after its debut. Yet even that late success felt bittersweet. The world was still listening, but it wasn't really hearing him anymore. The partnership between Atlantic and Malaco eventually dissolved, leaving King without the structure that had once supported him. He signed new deals first with Miami's TK Records, which produced his 1975 album Well Done and the minor hit I Feel Like Dynamite. Then with Mercury's Dial subsidiary for a single, Can You Dig It? But the spark was fading. He was caught in a space no artist ever wants to be in, too established to start over, yet too old-fashioned for the changing charts. The rise of disco left little room for the Southern soul sound he embodied. And while younger acts were finding fame with drum machines and glitter, King Floyd was still searching for that perfect live groove, the kind that came from sweat, brass, and heart. He worked hard to adapt, but every move felt like swimming against the tide. By the late part of the decade, even the audiences who once danced to Groove Me were chasing new rhythms. For every concert he booked, another was canceled. For every session he recorded, another project stalled. Still, he refused to quit. There was resilience in his silence, a quiet dignity in refusing to chase trends. Music comes from the soul, he once said in an interview. When it stops being about that, I'll stop doing it. But the industry had already stopped listening. The same radio stations that once couldn't go a day without playing his voice had now moved on to the next sensation. By 1978, King Floyd packed his bags once again, heading west to Los Angeles in search of a fresh start. The city had changed since the last time he'd been there. So had he. He carried no entourage, no record deal, just a handful of songs and a reputation that was fading faster than the echoes of his last hit. And as he watched the sun set over the California skyline, the man who once made America dance wondered if the world still had a place for his groove. When King Floyd left for Los Angeles in 1978, he wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing peace. The industry that once celebrated him had grown colder, and so had the city. The same studios that once buzzed with energy now felt mechanical, filled with synthesizers and disco beats that drowned out the kind of groove he built his life on. He was a soul singer in a world that had forgotten soul. King tried to adapt. He recorded demos, met producers, and searched for collaborators who still believed in real instruments and raw voices. But record executives wanted something else: flash, rhythm boxes, and fast hooks. When they listened to him sing, they nodded politely, then asked, "Do you have something more? Current?" That question haunted him. The groove that once made him special was now considered dated. The clubs that used to fill up when he sang were now lit with mirror balls and pounding four-on-the-floor disco. The crowd had changed, and so had the rhythm of America. For the first time, King began to retreat inward. The confidence that once carried him on stage turned into quiet frustration. Friends noticed he smiled less. He spent long nights alone, replaying his old tapes, wondering if he could have done something differently. Then came the hardest truth. Success had never been built to last. Without the support of a strong label or a loyal management team, every opportunity slipped through his fingers. The financial strain grew heavier. He booked local gigs when he could, but they barely covered expenses. By the early part of 1979, King faced what every artist fears: silence. No calls, no tours, no studio sessions, just silence. He wasn't the first artist to be forgotten by Hollywood, but it hurt all the same. The fame that once lifted him had left a shadow he couldn't escape. Some nights, he'd drive through Los Angeles, passing billboards of the new stars, young faces smiling beneath the same lights that once shone for him. In those quiet drives, he talked to himself, not out of madness, but memory. He'd say lines like, "They can't take the groove out of me," then laugh softly, as if reassuring himself that what he created still mattered. Eventually, he realized that the answer wasn't in Los Angeles. The city of second chances had given him enough firsts. So he went back home to Kenner, Louisiana, the place where the music had first found him. But home had changed too. The bars were smaller, the crowds older, and the local scene no longer pulsed with the same life. Still, he sang. He always sang, because even when no one else was listening, the music was the one thing that never turned its back on him. King Floyd had known applause, gold records, and flashing lights. Now, he was learning the weight of silence and the grace it sometimes brings. Back in Kenner, Louisiana, King Floyd found himself in a quieter world. The fame was gone, but the rhythm remained. He played small clubs, community events, and even bars where no one recognized his name. Sometimes, a middle-aged fan would approach him after the show and say, "You still got it, man." He'd smile, politely, grateful, but deep down, he knew it wasn't the same. In 1982, he managed to secure a brief tour in South Africa. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. He performed for crowds who didn't care about chart positions or record labels, they just wanted to feel something real. For a few nights, he felt alive again. When he sang "Groove Me," the audience moved in perfect unison, just like they had a decade earlier in America. It was proof that soul had no borders. When he came home, though, the momentum faded again. The phone stopped ringing. The industry had moved on completely. Funk was out, pop was in, and King was caught in the middle of a timeline that no longer included him. Over the next 20 years, he drifted in and out of music. He released a few small projects, none of which found much attention. There were rumors that he worked odd jobs between gigs, but those who knew him said he never complained. Music had never been about fame for him, it was about expression, about survival. Then, in 2000, Malaco Records offered him a chance to record again. The album was called Old School Funk, a title that felt both nostalgic and defiant. It didn't make the charts, but it was a love letter to the sound that made him who he was. King recorded it with the same fire he'd carried since the beginning. It was his way of saying, "I'm still here." Ironically, recognition found him again in a way he never expected. In 1995, reggae artist Shaggy had sampled his song Boombastic, crediting King Floyd as a writer. Years later, Wu-Tang Clan used his track Don't Leave Me Lonely for their song For Heaven's Sake on Wu-Tang Forever. New generations were dancing to his groove without even realizing it. His rhythm had outlived his fame. But time was catching up. Years of touring, heartbreak, and the grind of an unforgiving industry had taken their toll. He kept a small circle of friends and family close, performing occasionally around New Orleans when his health allowed. His voice was softer now, but the soul was still there, aged like old whiskey, deep and warm. On the 6th of March 2006, King Floyd passed away at the age of 61 from complications of a stroke and diabetes. News outlets ran short tributes, most just a few lines long. But for those who had truly listened, for the ones who still remembered the first time they heard Groove Me, his death felt like the end of an era. He had once said, "The groove don't fade, it just waits for somebody to find it again." And in the silence that followed his passing, that groove kept playing softly, endlessly, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Long after King Floyd left the spotlight, his music never truly disappeared. It lingered in the corners of record stores, in dusty vinyl crates, in radio stations that still played old soul on Sunday afternoons. His voice, smooth yet defiant, became part of the fabric of American sound. For those who grew up in New Orleans, Groove Me wasn't just a song. It was a memory. It was the sound of cookouts, family reunions, and block parties under the southern Sunday. It was the beat that made people forget their troubles, if only for 3 minutes. Even as time passed, the groove refused to die. By the late part of the century, a quiet revival began. DJs in Europe and collectors in Japan started hunting for classic American soul and funk records, rediscovering artists who had been forgotten by the mainstream. Among them was King Floyd. His records, once sold for a few dollars, were suddenly sought-after treasures. The needle dropped, the bass kicked in, and younger listeners who had never heard his name asked the same question older fans had been asking for decades. How did a man this good ever get forgotten? Back in America, the echoes of his work began to surface in unexpected ways. In 1995, when Shaggy released Boombastic, it became a global hit. Few listeners knew that the track credited King Floyd as a writer, connecting his groove to a new generation dancing under entirely different lights. Later, Wu-Tang Clan, at the height of their fame, sampled his song Don't Leave Me Lonely for their track For Heaven's Sake on Wu-Tang Forever. Through those samples, his rhythm found new life echoing through speakers in New York, London, and Tokyo. King never lived to see how far his influence reached, but those who knew him said he would have smiled quietly at the thought. To him, music was never about fame, it was about connection. If a beat could make someone move, then it had done its job. In 2000, he released Old School Funk through Malaco Records, a fitting title for an artist who never surrendered his roots. The album didn't climb charts or dominate radio, but it served as his final statement, a reaffirmation of the groove that defined him. Listening to it now feels like visiting an old friend. The voice is older, the tempo slower, but the emotion still unmistakable. Today, artists and historians cite King Floyd as a key figure in the evolution of Southern funk and soul. His music bridged the energy of James Brown and the vulnerability of Otis Redding, shaping a space uniquely his own. His groove may have been born in the 1,970 seconds, but it pulses through every generation that follows. You can hear traces of it in neo-soul, in R&B revival, even in hip-hop's deeper cuts. His rhythm became part of the DNA of American music, quiet, steady, and eternal. King Floyd may have left the stage, but the groove never left him. And because of that, it never left us. After King Floyd's passing in 2006, something unexpected began to happen. His music, once buried beneath decades of changing trends, started to surface again. It wasn't through major labels or flashy tributes, it was through people. DJs, record collectors, and everyday fans began sharing his songs online, rediscovering the magic that had once made Groove Me a national anthem. Across America, old vinyl shops placed his records in their front windows again. Music historians called him one of the missing links between New Orleans funk and mainstream soul, a man who carried the rhythm of the streets into the sound of a generation. For younger musicians searching for authenticity, King Floyd became a touchstone, a reminder that soul didn't come from perfection, but from truth. In New Orleans, his legacy took on a deeper meaning. Locals spoke of him with pride, calling him our king, not because of fame, but because of how he represented the city's resilience. His story mirrored the spirit of New Orleans itself, brilliant, battered, and unbreakable. At small jazz clubs and open mic nights, young artists began covering Groove Me again, reintroducing it to audiences who hadn't even been born when it first topped the charts. His influence stretched far beyond Louisiana. In the UK and Japan, radio programs dedicated entire segments to his music, calling him one of soul's forgotten pioneers. Collectors discussed his work with the same reverence given to names like Curtis Mayfield and Al Green. And as digital streaming made the past accessible again, new generations stumbled upon Groove Me and felt the same instinctive pull the beat, the honesty, the joy. American critics began to reevaluate his catalog. Think About It, once overlooked, gained a second life among audiophiles who praised its balance of emotion and raw production. Writers described it as a record ahead of its time, noting how Floyd's vocal phrasing anticipated the R&B crooners who would follow decades later. But perhaps the most profound recognition came from the people who had danced to him the first time around. Fans wrote messages on forums and comment sections, recalling their youth, the block parties, the first slow dances. For them, hearing Groove Me wasn't just nostalgia, it was time travel. King Floyd's story became more than a biography. It became a parable about the nature of fame, timing, and endurance. He wasn't a superstar, but he didn't need to be. His music survived where headlines did not. In the end, history began to correct itself. The world that had once moved too fast to notice him finally slowed down long enough to listen. His groove became a symbol of something larger, the persistence of artistry in a world obsessed with novelty. They say legends never die, but for some, it takes time for the world to realize they were legends all along. King Floyd was one of them, a man who gave everything to the rhythm, and in doing so, became eternal. The story of King Floyd isn't just about a man who had a hit record. It's about what happens after the applause fades, about holding on to purpose when the world stops listening. He came from the streets of New Orleans, carrying nothing but his voice and a dream that refused to die. That dream took him from corner stages to the top of the Billboard charts. And for a moment, he stood among giants. He didn't need the spotlight to prove his worth. The music itself was the proof. When the industry moved on, he didn't break, he adapted. When fame slipped away, he didn't grow bitter, he kept playing. And when time tried to bury his name, his groove found a way to rise again through other artists, other songs, other generations. In many ways, King Floyd's journey mirrors the story of soul music itself, born from struggle, built on faith, and kept alive by those who refuse to forget. His voice may no longer echo in concert halls, but it still drifts through radios, playlists, and memories. Every time someone hits play on Groove Me, he's there again, alive, smiling, and making the world move. Sometimes, legacy isn't measured in trophies or headlines. It's measured in feeling, in the way a song can lift someone's heart 50 years later, or remind them of who they were when they first heard it. That's what King Floyd gave us. Not just rhythm, but remembrance. If you close your eyes, you can still hear him. The horns, the bass, the beat that never loses its warmth. It's more than nostalgia, it's proof that true soul never fades. And maybe that's the lesson in his story. That even when the world forgets, the music remembers. Do you think Hollywood and the music industry ever gave him the respect he truly deserved? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us keep his groove alive. Because stories like this remind us why we do what we do, why we tell these tales of talent, heartbreak, and timeless rhythm. King Floyd may have left this world in silence, but his groove still plays, softly, faithfully, waiting for someone new to listen. The world forgot, but we remember.